There's a machine in the deserts of Qinghai province so big it could power the entire country of Norway on its own. It's called Gonghe Talaton. It's the largest solar plant on Earth. Here's the part that doesn't add up. It might be losing money, not despite being the biggest, because it's the biggest. Hang on to that sentence. It's going to explain almost everything about how China quietly took over the future of global energy. And it's going to explain why the exact thing that made it unstoppable might be the same thing that eventually breaks it. In 2024, China spent $940 billion on clean energy. That's more than the entire GDP of Poland. 64% of every new watt of renewable power installed on the planet last year was built there. 7 out of every 10 electric cars made anywhere in the world were built there. This isn't an industry anymore. It's a takeover. Almost nobody explains the part that actually matters. How did a country that was literally starving 50 years ago pull this off? And why might the playbook that built this empire now be eating it alive from the inside? 3 parts. First, the guy who started it in a fishing village nobody had heard of. Second, the machine Beijing built around him. Third, the number that flips the whole story on its head. Let's get into it. To understand any of this, you have to start with a famine. In 1958, Chairman Mao tried to drag China into the industrial age in a single leap. He called it the Great Leap Forward. Farms were collectivized overnight. Villages were ordered to melt down pots and tools in backyard furnaces to hit absurd steel quotas. Local officials lied about harvests that didn't exist because they were terrified of reporting bad news. Between 15 and 55 million people starved to death. It remains one of the deadliest policy failures in human history. Mao died in 1976. He left behind a country that was poor, closed off, and traumatized. The man who ended up leading it out of the wreckage was someone Mao had personally purged. Twice. His crime was believing markets worked better than 5-year plans. His name was Deng Xiaoping. He had a line that would define the next 4 decades of Chinese history. It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. Translation: stop arguing about ideology. Start figuring out what actually works. Under Deng, China cracked the door open. Prices were allowed to float. Entrepreneurs were allowed to exist. Beijing tried something genuinely radical for a communist state in a handful of coastal towns. Special economic zones, low tax, light rules, foreign money welcome. One of those towns was a quiet fishing village on the border of Hong Kong. Its name was Shenzhen. By the 1990s, quiet was not a word anyone used for Shenzhen anymore. It was a gold rush town. It pulled in workers by the thousands from across rural China to staff factories churning out pens, clothes, and watch batteries. Anything the world would buy cheap. One of those workers was a chemistry graduate from a poor family of 8 kids in Anhui province. His name was Wang Chuanfu. He landed a job at a battery company. 2 years later, he quit and started his own. He named it after the street his tiny factory sat on, Yadi Road. He called it Yadi Electronics. Here's what made Wang dangerous. In the mid-90s, China's GDP per person was around $600. In Japan, it was $44,000. In South Korea, it was $12,000. That gap meant Wang could make batteries cheap enough to outprice Sony and Toyota, even with worse technology and cruder factories. By 2000, his little company was the largest mobile phone battery maker on the planet. In 2002, he took it public in Hong Kong. He raised over $200 million. You know the company under a different name now, BYD. The whole country was accelerating around Wang. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. It was a single decision that blew the doors open to global markets. Over the next 10 years, GDP per person grew 5-fold again. By 2007, exports made up roughly 60% of China's entire economy. By 2010, China had overtaken Japan to become the world's second-largest economy. Full stop. But it was still mostly cheap stuff. That's the detail people skip. T-shirts, toys, plastic goods, low margin, low status, low tech. Wang had made a bet that looked borderline delusional. He bought a failing car company and pointed BYD at electric vehicles, years before almost anyone in the West took the idea seriously. In 2010, he set a public target. BYD would become the largest car producer on Earth by 2025. At the time, BYD ranked 26th in global car production. Not top 5, not top 10, 26th. It was behind GM, Volkswagen, Toyota, and a dozen names most people have never heard of. At that point, 80% of China's own electricity still came from burning coal. One man's whiteboard target in Shenzhen. That's genuinely where this story starts. Then, in 2012, a new leader walked into the room. He decided to make that whiteboard target a matter of national strategy. Xi Jinping came to power promising something Deng never really promised. not just growth, supremacy, a China dream. In 2015, his government released a document that reads less like economic policy and more like a hit list. It was called Made in China 2025. It did something unusually blunt for a government paper. It admitted the country's manufacturing was large, but not strong. Too dependent on foreign technology, short on real innovation. Then it named the industries China would go dominate: robotics, aerospace, biotech, electric vehicles, renewable energy. Wang Chuanfu's whiteboard dream in Shenzhen had just become a national project. So, 10 years later, how did it actually go? In the first 5 months of 2025 alone, China installed 244 gigawatts of new solar and wind capacity. That's more than 100 solar panels going up every single second for 5 straight months. It's enough to power all of Indonesia, or all of Turkey. China now makes 80% of the world's solar panels, 60% of its wind turbines, up to 90% of its lithium batteries. BYD is now the third largest car brand on the planet by volume. It runs factories in Brazil, Hungary, Thailand, and Turkey. And it started as a battery company from a napkin dream. Last year, China's trade surplus hit almost $1 trillion. That's not a growth story anymore. That's a conquest. Here's the question almost nobody actually answers. How does a country go from 26th place to first in 15 years? The honest answer isn't magic. It isn't just hard work either. It's money. Enormous, deliberate, state-directed money. Picture a video game where one player gets a permanent stat buff at character creation, cheaper rent, cheaper power, cheaper loans, a captive customer base, a government actively rooting for them from the sidelines. That's roughly what happened here. In 2019, the most recent year with solid data, the Chinese government spent $400 billion on industrial support. Sit with that number, $400 billion in a single year just to help favored industries win. It came stacked in layers. Layer 1, direct cash. China paid people to buy EVs from 2009 all the way to 2022. The subsidy per car actually shrank over time. It went from about $2,700 in 2010 down to $1,500 by 2022. But so many more cars were selling that the total bill kept climbing. It hit $5 billion in the final year alone. BYD collected $3.7 billion in subsidies between 2018 and 2022. Two of China's biggest wind turbine makers, Goldwind and Mingyang, each pulled in over $160 million. Layer 2, rigged pricing. For years, renewable power plants got paid more per unit of electricity than coal plants under a national feed-in tariff. That's gone at the national level now. Several provinces still run versions of it. Layer 3, cheap money. China's banking sector is dominated by state-owned banks. They control 60% of all assets in the system. When Beijing decides an industry matters, it doesn't lobby the banks. It tells them. Loans get approved based on national priority, not risk and return. Lately, that fire hose of credit has been pointed hard at manufacturing. China's property market has been in free fall, and Beijing needed somewhere else to put all that lending. Layer 4, cheap, everything else. Land, tax breaks, electricity. Earlier this year, Jiangsu province cut industrial power prices by 9% to protect factory margins. That's one of China's richest provinces. Layer 5, the government becomes the customer. In 2011, Shenzhen handed BYD the largest electric bus contract on Earth. In 2020, EV maker NIO was about to collapse. The city of Hefei didn't wait to be asked. It directed state investment funds to buy a 24% stake for $1 billion. That essentially bailed the company out on the spot. Add it up. By 2018, government support was covering roughly 23% of the sticker price of every new electric vehicle sold in China. That's about $13,000 per car. Between 2009 and 2017 alone, the EV industry banked $61 billion in support. 80% of it was direct subsidies and tax breaks. Now, you might say every country subsidizes industries. You'd be right. Tesla lives off generous US tax credits. Most wealthy nations protect strategic industries in some form. But there's a scale problem. China's industrial support equals 1.7% of its entire GDP. That's more than double what South Korea spends, 4 times the US or Germany. And there's a deeper problem underneath the scale one. It's a problem most coverage of this story completely misses. If this were just a story about subsidies, it would be a fairly boring trade dispute. One country spends more. It wins more market share. Everyone else complains. Tariffs go up. Rinse and repeat. But go back to how we opened. A machine big enough to power Norway, possibly losing money. That's not a throwaway detail. That's the twist. And it's the part of this story that actually tells you where this goes next. Here's a sentence that should stop you. China can currently produce almost twice as many solar panels as the entire planet wants to buy. In 2023, Chinese factories had the capacity to churn out 861 gigawatts of solar modules in a single year. Global demand that year was less than half of that. This isn't an accident. It's baked directly into how the Chinese economy is built. For decades, Beijing poured money into production instead of into things that make ordinary people richer and spend more. Not healthcare, not pensions, not wages, not a real safety net. Instead, it built roads, ports, factories, and labs. And it kept its currency, the yuan, deliberately weak, so all of that output would stay cheap to sell abroad. The result: Chinese households save an enormous share of what they earn. They spend comparatively little. In 2023, consumption made up only 40% of China's GDP. The global average is 57%. Zoom out further, and it gets stranger. According to Deutsche Bank, China accounts for 32% of all global manufacturing, but it accounts for only 12% of global consumption. It builds almost a third of everything the world makes. It buys barely a tenth of what the world buys. That gap has to go somewhere. It goes out the door as exports at prices that keep sliding because there's simply too much supply chasing too few buyers. Since 2017, Chinese solar panel exports have grown sevenfold. In that same window, the average price has collapsed by more than 60%, which brings us back to that solar farm in the desert. Look at the share prices of China's flagship renewable companies: Longyi Solar, Trina Solar, Mingyang. Not up and to the right, down. They're not just competing with the rest of the world. They're competing with each other in a market that has more supply than the entire planet currently needs. China didn't just build an industry that beats the world on price. It may have built an industry that's quietly bleeding out its own champions to do it. A US official warns that Chinese exports risk gutting American manufacturing. Beijing responds that its companies are simply more competitive. They're both a little bit right, and they're both missing the actual point. This was never really a clean fight about who subsidizes more. It's a structural choice, made and remade for 40 straight years. Build capacity, not consumption. Now the entire global market for clean energy sits downstream of that one decision. So here's the real question. Not, is China cheating? Not even, is China winning? The real question is, can China afford to keep winning like this? Think about what that machine actually is. It produces nearly twice what the world needs. It's run by companies that are losing money. And it's propped up by a government that's poured hundreds of billions of dollars into keeping it running. That's not a normal, healthy economy. That's a bet. A massive bet that eventually the rest of the world will need everything China can build. For the rest of us, there's an uncomfortable trade sitting underneath all of this. Cheaper solar panels, cheaper EVs, cheaper batteries. That's genuinely good for your wallet, and it's genuinely good for the planet. But it's coming from an economic model that's willing to burn through its own companies to get there. Increasingly, it's willing to burn through other countries' companies too. So here's what I actually want to know. The panels on your roof, the battery in your phone, the car in your driveway. They might all trace back to that one machine in the Chinese desert. Does that bother you? Or, at this price, do you just not care? Tell me in the comments. If you want more of this, subscribe. We go this deep on how the global economy actually works every week. See you in the next one.